I used to go around saying that I'm a person with lots of hobbies. Turns out that's ADHD. I used to say I get bored easily and so need to keep myself busy. Turns out that's also ADHD. I used to go around saying I'm impatient and I just want to see results as soon as possible. You guessed it, also ADHD. Hello and welcome to Through the Noise Coaching, a YouTube channel run by me, Lee. I'm a leadership coach who specialises in growing the careers and businesses of people who are neurospicy. I also have ADHD. That's possibly not all I have, but ever since I got diagnosed, I've kind of been thinking about this question. How much of my personality is me versus how much of it is ADHD? Now, before I go into this video, I do have to do the usual disclaimer. This video is not meant to diagnose anyone with ADHD. I'm not qualified to do that. There's a whole diagnostic criteria and steps for that, and I'm not qualified to implement that at all. What I have been doing instead is reminiscing on my university days by going through Google Scholar and finding and reading interesting papers around ADHD and personality. And so we're going to look at a few of these today. But in order to get into the meat of the question, what is ADHD and what is my personality, I first need to tackle the question of how does ADHD affect my personality? So let's dive into that. I actually have a recording of me talking about some things that in hindsight are clearly my ADHD a few months before I started questioning it. And I think it's really interesting to have a listen to some of them now. Here's one.
I learn things that I'm genuinely interested in. And so when you are genuinely interested, it gets you to dive in more in these things.
Sounds like an interest-based attention system, right? How about this one?
I'm a person that's interested in many different things and I don't do any things by halves. So I kind of throw myself into a lot of different areas.
And then I listed like 10 different hobbies of things that I'm interested in. I remember being a teenager and talking about crazes, which is what I called them at the time, which is when I would obsess over a particular aspect of pop culture or a particular hobby and love it so much and then move on to something else, which is exactly how my hyperfixations still work to this day. There's also parts of my personality that aren't ADHD related at all. One of the things that is common about ADHD is that people really struggle to stick to a routine. They get bored of having some routine, which is something that I absolutely love. If you're thinking, it sounds like it could be autism too, yeah, I'm aware. So I guess what I'm saying at this point is that ADHD is very closely entwined with my personality, but I'm too close to the inside of my own head to be able to work out what is me and what is my ADHD. So instead, I do what any mathematician does, and I turn to science. So I'm going to start by looking at two studies, one from 2013, one from 2016, who look at ADHD and personality using two different types of personality metrics. Adult ADHD symptoms and 5-factor model traits in a clinical sample, a structural equation modelling approach. I had to read that, I couldn't memorise that name. Looks at the big 5 personality traits, which are ones that I'm personally familiar with. It's called the 5-factor model in this paper, which I believe is the more scientific name, but Big 5 is a colloquial name that I imagine many of us are already familiar with. So this is a paper that we're going to start with. If you're not aware of the 5-factor model, it's a model that emerged in the 90s from various different sets of researchers around about the same time that claims that we can look at our personality across 5 dimensions. So these 5 dimensions are extroversion, gregariousness, outgoing, conscientiousness, organised and self-discipline, neuroticism, sensitive and nervous, agreeableness, friendly and compassionate, and open to experience shown by curiosity and inventiveness. Now, typically these personality traits in an individual are assessed by a self-report questionnaire or a questionnaire of someone who knows us very well, like a parent or a partner. Now, this is kind of important because there is an interpretation question and maybe a bias question here when it comes to self-report measures. We'll come back to talking about that a little bit later. It's also important to note certain features of the test population. So this test population were adults who were medicated for ADHD, but still required further help managing their symptoms. They were also 84% college educated. And I just like to point out that statement because so many ADHD kids are written off at school as not being able to academically achieve everything. And I know college education isn't the be-all and end-all, but the fact that 84% of this study had a college degree means that we're definitely capable of that. We just need the right support and we can do amazing things. But I digress. It's important to note that these aspects of the sample population can affect the results, as can the fact that this sample population was 90% white. So the study then looked at 3 different aspects of ADHD: inattentiveness, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. And I really like that the study did this because ADHD isn't one monolithic thing. we all present differently, and we all present differently on these particular factors. So it's really nice to see things broken down by these factors. The results are super interesting. The first thing they notice is that the score for conscientiousness for the ADHD sample was actually 2 standard deviations below the mean. This is a huge difference, and if I'm honest, it's something that makes me a little bit defensive, because I personally score very high on conscientiousness, so I'm immediately like, no, that doesn't fit me. It also feels like something that ADHDers get shamed for not being organised enough, for not working hard enough, for being lazy. And it's because we struggle with those aspects due to our ADHD. But despite my own biases here, which I'm being very upfront about, let's dive a little bit further in. Because it turns out that the effect of ADHD on conscientiousness really depends on the factor of ADHD. While there was a correlation between low conscientiousness and inattentive ADHD symptoms, they actually found that for hyperactiveness, there was a correlation in the opposite direction. The paper also noted that inattentive symptoms tend to be the things that adults seek help with more readily. They tend to feel more impaired by their inattentive symptoms than their hyperactive or impulsive symptoms. There's also a suggestion that executive function struggles could be part of what causes that gap, but we're going to come back to that a bit more later. The next largest difference between ADHD and the standard norm is that we tend to be higher in neuroticism. We tend to be a bit more neurotic. What's super interesting about that is that it also correlates with the inattentive factor of ADHD, which to me is kind of counterintuitive. I would have thought that that is more tied with emotional dysregulation and impulsivity, but they didn't find any predictive power between those two in their study. This immediately makes me wonder about cause and effect here, because if inattentive symptoms are things that we're being shamed for from a young age, is that what causes a higher neuroticism to develop? ADHDers were also found to have higher openness to experience, but that didn't seem to vary with any of the 3 factors, which is an interesting result in itself. There was a small effect on agreeableness, with ADHDers being a little bit less agreeable. This was correlated with the impulsivity trait, and the suggestion was that potentially this could be emotional dysregulation, means that we struggle a little bit more with that agreeableness aspect. The last link they found was that hyperactivity tended to predict extroversion, although the ADHD group didn't have particularly higher extroversion than the norm in general. It paints an interesting picture, namely that conscientiousness and neuroticism are affected by our ADHD, but actually more so our particular flavour of ADHD and where we score higher on these combination of symptoms. Now, I just talked through this a lot, and it was kind of confusing when I was going through this paper, making this summary to keep track of everything. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put up this table here that just walks you through what the different results were. The first column is the personality traits of the 5-factor model. The second is how the group of ADHD adults scored compared to the standard. And then the next 3 columns are how each personality trait correlates with each ADHD trait, where a positive correlation means the 2 increase together, and a negative correlation means that when one increases, the other decreases. We're now going to look at the second paper that I dived into on this topic. This one was called Personality Profiles in Adults with Attention Deficit Hyperactive Disorder, ADHD, published in 2016. The paper comes out the gate strong. I'm going to read you a quote. Early studies in this field reveal that adults with ADHD tend to be more pessimistic, introverted, rebellious, and aggressive, show high levels of psychological distress, dissatisfaction, low capacity to be organised and self-disciplined, and are less sociable, altruistic, and sympathetic to others. I don't know about you, but reading that immediately puts me on the defensive a little bit. It feels like a personal attack. It kind of feels like a bad school report in a way. It also feeds into the narrative that ADHD is solely bad, which bothers me a little bit. But as I said, I'm being upfront about my own biases, and I'm going to try and put them to the side while I talk through the rest of the paper. But before I do want to note that despite being published after the paper that we just discussed, it doesn't reference that paper at all, which is kind of interesting. So instead of the 5-factor model used in the previous paper, this paper uses a temperament and character inventory, the TCI, which is also a self-report questionnaire. I did do a bit of research to find out if the TCI could be mapped onto the 5-factor model, but it turns out that while TCI aspects were moderately correlated with one or more aspect of the Big 5, the correlation was outweighed by the differences between them. That suggests that they're inconsistent measures of personality. So let's take a look at the TCI. It's split into dimensions of temperament and dimensions of character. The 4 dimensions of temperament are novelty seeking, harm avoidance, reward dependence, and persistence, whereas the 3 dimensions of character are self-directedness, cooperativeness, and self-transcendence. So previous studies on this topic have suggested that people with ADHD have high novelty seeking, which they define as impulsive and irritable instead of stoic and rigid, and high harm avoidance, defined as pessimistic and anxious instead of optimistic and risk-taking. That's kind of interesting, that point around risk-taking, but we'll move on for now. They also suggested low persistence, defined as persevering and ambitious versus easily discouraged and indolent, and low reward dependence, defined as sociable and warm versus aloof and cold. On the character side, they suggest low self-directedness, defined as a tendency towards being blaming and inept. They also found low cooperativeness, associated with hostility and opportunism, and high self-transcendence, associated with being intuitive and insightful. The study then goes on to suggest that this supports the idea of low psychological functioning, something that I find kind of offensive considering I got the highest mark out of my entire master's degree. But let's put these biases aside again. The study decided to invest these factors with ourselves. Now, in contrast to the previous group, 75% of their ADHD population was unmedicated in this instance. They also controlled for comorbidities amongst the ADHD group, but not amongst the control group, which is kind of interesting. They found that ADHD was correlated with higher novelty seeking, higher harm avoidance, and higher self-transcendence, but lower self-directedness and cooperativeness. Similarly to the last paper, this did split up the ADHD types, one category that was primarily inattentive, and then they wanted to split primarily hyperactive impulsive and combined into 2 separate categories, but there were too few of primarily impulsive hyperactive, so they combined that second category into 1. Interestingly enough, they actually found that inattentiveness was correlated with lower novelty seeking. It also correlated with higher harm avoidance and lower self-directiveness. Hyperactivity was positively correlated with novelty seeking and self-transcendence. It also made a distinction between severity of current ADHD, with those with more severe ADHD correlated with higher novelty seeking, reward dependence, and self-transcendence, but lower self-directedness. From there, the paper actually gets a little bit self-contradictory. For example, it comments on novelty seeking being associated with extroversion in social situations, but harm avoidance being correlated with being socially reserved. If ADHD is a high on both of those are a bit contradictory, aren't they? Another contradiction is that people with ADHD tend to be easily worried and fearful due to the harm avoidance trait, but they tend to be satisfied due to the self-transcendence trait. The paper concludes that ADHD tends to be correlated with specific personality traits that tend to predict poorer mental health outcomes, which, in that case, they're probably right. I know we do struggle with mental health more than the general population. I do appreciate that they acknowledge that they haven't really taken into account environmental factors that may affect this, and they're not sure whether the ADHD is causing the personality symptoms or not. They also acknowledge that inattentive and hyperactive impulsive tend to have different personality symptoms, and also that we need longitudinal studies to look at how this changes over lifetime. Again, this is quite a lot to take in, so I'll put a summary graphic up. Just pause for a couple of seconds and process this. When I compare this to the previous study, I think there's a few things that are interesting. They're both similar sizes. The Big 5 study had 117 participants, this one has 89. But the people they're looking at are potentially very different. The TCI study implies that people with ADHD have low psychological functioning, whereas the 5-factor model study found that 84% were college educated. Of course, these two things aren't the same thing at all, and I don't mean to imply that you are low functioning if you didn't go to college. I think that's utter nonsense. The point I'm making is that these two papers come in from very different stances when they're looking at ADHD, and so we need to keep that in mind when evaluating the results. One more thing that has been going through my mind as I read both of these papers is that the personality questionnaires are both done on self-report, and people with ADHD tend to actually have lower self-esteem. And so that means we're more likely to rank ourselves in a more negative way. As I was writing this script, I actually took a lunch break where I watched Dr. B on the How to ADHD channel talk about a similar topic. In the context of a discussion around relationship abuse for people who are neurodivergent, he actually says, "So many of us have been chastised our entire lives and told, well, you clearly don't understand what's going on socially, till eventually so many of us would just adopt this message of, well, God, I must not understand what's going on socially, and I must be in the wrong." And I would argue that the self-report questionnaires are picking up on this aspect. For example, when we look at conscientiousness, so many of us growing up were told we were lazy, we were disorganised, we weren't able to do anything productive, all of those things that feed into conscientiousness. And so, of course, we're more likely to rank ourselves lower on that because that's a message that we've received. I would consider this to be a bias because of the methodology that was used, but also the fact that it ignores the environmental factors that might be affecting this. On a similar topic, I wanted to refer to a third study from 2020 called Executive Functions, Personality Traits and ADHD Symptoms in Adolescence, a Mediation Analysis. It looks at the linkage between ADHD and the 5-factor model, but also executive function traits. I actually really like this paper for a number of reasons. Firstly, the excellent description of executive function at the start, but also the acknowledgement that ADHD shows up in different ways in different parts of our lives, something that the former 2 papers had acknowledged but hadn't looked into yet. The study looked at 3 aspects of executive function: working memory, inhibition, and flexibility. Now, when I see flexibility written there, my mind immediately goes, what about the very large overlap between ADHD and autism in the ADHD population? But the paper doesn't go into this and only focuses on ADHD, so we'll park that question for another day. So I'm not going to go into as much detail about this study, but I recommend taking a look if you get time. But the result I wanted to point out was that higher scores on conscientiousness correlated with higher executive function trait scores and lower inattentive symptoms. In a nutshell, what this is saying is that the lower conscientiousness found in the first study and the similar symptoms found in a TCI study can be explained by executive functioning issues. The whole reason we rank ourselves lower in this personality trait is because of the aspect of ADHD that means that we struggle with this. So we get told that's because we're not conscientious and we internalize this problem. And in my mind, this is super important because when I think of low conscientiousness, I think of people who are not working hard. But the amount of work that we put into trying to manage our executive function challenges is hard work. We have to work so much harder than everyday people to be able to manage these challenges. It's just not seen that way because it's work that neurotypicals don't have to do. We are conscientious because we work hard on solving this problem. Honestly, this whole topic is fascinating. Based on these studies, there seems to be enough evidence to suggest that there are things in our personality that are directly caused by our ADHD. There's definitely some biases in the interpretations, there's some environmental factors missing, but there's enough evidence for me to think that the 2 are very linked. So with that question in mind, how much of my personality is me? And how much of it is ADHD? That's a topic for next week because this video is really long enough as it is, but I'm really excited to dive into it. In the meantime, leave me a comment with your thoughts. How much of your personality on the Big 5 scale correlates with the findings, for example? If you found this video interesting, you might be interested in watching my previous video about how YouTube diagnosed me with ADHD. Thank you for your attention. I'll see you in the next one.